Okay, so again, welcome, and I want to thank the organizers, though I've helped to organize some of this. Thank the association for letting us have this, and really also thank everybody who's coming to both participate and to listen, because it's really during COVID-19, we've all had a lot of challenges, and part of the challenge to education is moving everything online, but perhaps one of the benefits that comes out of this is that we can run an internationally driven type of conference much more easily than we would have been able to do prior to this when everyone had to travel. So my presentation is called Validation Through Classical Allusion. It's about creative referencing as a social vector of validity in classical Chinese medical text. So I'm looking at the classical Chinese medical tradition and how doctors have a validity in the treatment, during the treatment experience in the treatment room, and looking at that from a social dynamic. Okay, so first, let's talk for a moment about what we call traditional Chinese medicine, sometimes classical Chinese medicine. And this really describes the pre-modern medical system of what's known as a Sinitic sphere, which is China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. So we interchangeably use the term East Asian medicine, which is perhaps more politically correct because it's not uniquely Chinese, because the national border of what we now consider modern China did not exist back thousands of years ago. So I'm going to use this term traditional Chinese medicine because the research that I'm presenting is really focused on the Chinese tradition at the moment, looking back at the Chinese classics, as opposed to the Korean classics, the Japanese classics, the Vietnamese classics, which are all part of the tradition, but not necessarily part of the paper and the research that I'm doing right now. So this also in the modern day has melded together with concepts, Western medical concepts. But it maintains four approaches that are collectively known as the four pillars, which include acupuncture and moxibustion, acupuncture being the use of needles on different spots on the body, and moxibustion being the burning of an herb, Artemisia vulgaris, which is the common mugwort plant burned on the body to stimulate the points used in acupuncture in a slightly different way. Herbs and diet are the second pillar, looking at, of course, herbs that are certain chemicals that affect the body in certain ways, but plant-based chemicals for the most part, and diet, meaning not diet for calories and carbohydrates, but for therapeutic response. And physical manipulation and massage. Now, physical manipulation includes bone setting. Traditionally, the people who did traditional Chinese medicine in ancient China set your bones if you broke them. Nowadays, it's done by an orthopedist, but still the idea of alignment, how well your bones are aligned, and massage and postural correction and exercise, all those things we now subsume in a lot of physical therapy, were still part of traditional Chinese medicine. And then last is therapeutic breathing techniques, things where you breathe in a certain way, things what we now call Qigong, which are Qi cultivation practices, which is breath and force and energy. Those are part of the modern traditional Chinese medical approach maintained from the classical period. Okay. Now, however, we're going to be talking today about validity and how the validation occurred for the classical provider. So part of that's what's called canonization. And canonization is where you elevate a text to a sacred status, where the text is considered inviolate, which means it cannot be disagreed with. Whoops, sorry, cannot be disagreed with. Canonization occurs worldwide in many religious traditions and many other traditions. In China, it occurred in Confucianism, which was politics, in Taoism, the Taoist religious and philosophical tradition, in Buddhism, in military theory, where they canonized books like The Art of War, and in medicine, where they canonized medical classes. Okay. And the reserve of this canonical literature shaped a really interesting way that medicine was validated. The veneration of these canons demanded what I call justification through classical allusion, to make a reference to an old book to be justified. And it gives rise to creative interpretation as how your original idea is rejected unless you can show that it was reflected in these ancient books. Okay? And that gives rise to something known as the originator-commentator relationship. So here, this is a social phenomenon through all of Confucian East Asia, because they venerated their ancestors and they canonized books. So you had to have justification via antiquity. It was more important to show your idea was misunderstood from the ancient period than say it's unique. You couldn't say, I thought it up, because they'd say, who are you? You're nobody, right? Rather, oh, it came down from the ancient period, right? And it played out in the intellectual history of ancient China until the end of the imperial period, which is 1911, so all the way into the beginning of the 20th century. And also the scarcity of the original source materials. You couldn't go to the internet. You couldn't go to the library. You couldn't get these books easily. It allowed you to fabricate citations, as every one of our undergraduate students have done, right? To fabricate a citation, and it gives weight to your opinion. And you couldn't easily counter it if someone said, well, it said this in the ancient book. You're like, I don't know, I didn't read the ancient book. So all of a sudden their argument has support. So now we're going to talk for a second about a sociological idea, the clinical event, right? Clinical event. The clinical event is the interaction of doctor with patient in that moment. And you have to apply your medical principles in real time at that moment when the sick person's in front of you. There's an immediacy of this. It forces the doctor to act on a base of knowledge and skill that the doctor has in his or her consciousness. So they're remembering these things, what to do, and based on that and what they see in the patient's body. So a reference could be checked. They could run out and check a reference. The necessity, the time necessity, the temporal necessity of treatment says you can't say, I'm sorry, you're in pain, you're bleeding. I'll see you in 3 days when I research this. Can't happen. You got to act right away. So the doctor has to act on a limited body of the potentially relevant recorded data. It's based on what they remember and what they know. And the patient has an undefined moment, a liminal moment, a moment where they're not clear on what's going to go on. The doctor's ability is questioned. The patient's like, I don't know. Maybe the doctor knows what's going on. Maybe not. They're worried. And it's questioned because of the demands of the clinical event. Will you be able to save me? Will you be able to save my relative or whoever's getting treated? Okay. So all of a sudden, this question of the validity of what you do is called into question. So we talk about validity. And validity from a social perspective, it's a social dynamic. It's composed of 3 different other social vectors: power, prestige, and performativity. Now, power is imbued socially to the medical provider to allow action. The doctor can break your skin, can bleed you, he can amputate, can do all sorts of things that you can't normally do. If you amputate someone's arm, it's a crime. The doctor does it, it's medicine, right? There's very specific powers given to the doctor and controlled by certain certifications. Prestige, though, is another social dynamic. It's commanded by the social position of the doctor. How well known, how famous, how many people did he treat, or how many people did she treat? How well regarded are they? And that's also combined together with what's called performativity. And performativity is a metric, a measure. It's how well you fit your social role, not performance. So your social role as a doctor is defined by certain performance. You do certain things. But performativity is a sociological term that's used to say, how well do you fit that? Do you look like a doctor? Do you act like a doctor? Do you talk like a doctor? Do you do doctor things? Oh, that's a doctor. That's the performativity metric. So these things combine together. And the traditional Chinese medical doctor has a social role, but it's defined by Confucian social mores. In other words, the doctor, he or she, is perceived to be steeped in the classical medical books and use this wisdom from a hoary, venerated ancient past of ancient masters to solve the illness problems. So classical allusion, referencing these old books to the canons, supports this social matrix. And it improves the performativity metric. In other words, it lets people believe you're a doctor. And it limits the liminal experience, the nervous, I don't know what's going on experience of the patient. It puts them at ease. It validates the treatment because it says, oh, these ancient books said we should do this. And they say, oh, the ancient book said it. So it's validated and it makes the patient compliant to the plan. Because any medical provider will tell you, they don't follow the plan, they don't get better. So this validates it in the patient's mind. So this is what's known as canonical validation, validation by the canons. So the doctor's relationship to the classical canons is very complex. Why? They're hard to read. Chinese is hard enough to read in the modern day, hard to read in the classical period where the books were hundreds of years old that you were referencing. So it'd be like reading Chaucer and trying to say, okay, I understand Chaucer completely. Or if you're reading Shakespeare or reading, Beowulf and say, I'm quoting Beowulf to figure out what to do to treat you. Was very awkward because it was so divorced from their modern, even that time period's modern language. So it's influenced by the doctor's memory. Well, they can remember what it said. Varying interpretations. As the doctor's experience changes, he understands medicine differently. Lineage transmissions or interpretation as to where he was educated, who he studied under, what approach did they have, and the patient's unique expression of disease, because no patient that you're seeing is the same as someone described in a book, no matter what. So all of this combines together in the doctor's relationship to the classics. And the clinical event requires validation in the practitioner's mind and the patient's mind. So it drives this vector to have an illusion, a connection, right, to the specific foundations in the classic. And either you have to have that in your head or you create validity because of your connection to this perceived classical tradition. So referencing the classics as a proof of erudition, how smart you are, is a prestige metric. It gives you a social power vector. So now clinical efficacy. We have 2 slides to go, so we'll get through this. What's efficacy? Acute concerns, efficacy is very clear. You have a really bad cold, you get better. You have a really bad pain, you get better. Broken bone, you get better. But chronic concerns have a different melange of factors that come together with them. Color the experience in different levels of symptomology. There's qualitative and quantitative changes. Qualitative changes, how the quality of the pain is, the quality of discomfort, your quality of life are influenced by the social dimensions of medicine as much as the physical factors around, how well you feel about it. So the belief and validation of the prestige and power of the doctor gives what I call a course through the forest of liminality. And liminality is doubt or uncertainty. And it's a disease process. The patient doesn't know if they're going to get better. So the validation of the doctor makes them say, I could get better and have hope and have the will to live. In all medicine, efficacy is hard to figure out, hard to actually, to assess and assure someone. So the ongoing validation through illusion in traditional Chinese medicine. The modern day, right, we've seen the rise of Western medicine, and it has quantitative models. It's juxtaposed to traditional Chinese medicine. There's a foil to it. So Western medicine is quantitative. So modern traditional Chinese medicine is pushed to be qualitative. Western medicine is scientific. So TCM is pushed to be classically or holistically validated. But the validation vector is the same construct. The doctor, whether Western or Chinese, has to validate their clinical choices in the moment by referencing accepted material, which is not in the event. So the traditional doctor goes back to canons. The modern doctor goes to studies and says, this worked on thousands and thousands of people. Okay, so this is the last slide here. The modern traditional Chinese medical doctor. Thus, the validation vector perpetuates even now. The modern practitioner is divorced from the classical corpus of canons by time, by language and interpretation. They can't read these old books many times, especially if they're not Chinese. The modern traditional Chinese medical doctor is forced to slide into creative illusions and interpretations, the subconscious validity metric, and reference the wisdom or the holistic medical tradition, and plays often into Orientalist fantasies that there was a gilded, glorious age that was so much better to derive validity, power, and prestige through the performativity metric, which is the cognate to his classical predecessor. So some aspects of the medicine have stood the test of time as seen played out in the social vector. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And I